Okay, we're going to talk about the nervous system now. The nervous system is really probably the most important system in your body. It's what makes you human. It separates you from trees and plants and fungus and yeast. It allows you to see and receive stimulus and respond to stimulus and think, and it's really kind of, I think, the most important system in terms of being human. So when we look at the nervous system, there's two main parts to the nervous system, right? There's your brain and then your central nerve cord that runs down your backbone. We're vertebrates, which means that we have this nerve cord that runs down our back, as opposed to invertebrates that don't have a bony backbone protecting their nerve cord. But anyway, that central part is called the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord. And then that's connected to these peripheral nerves that go out to your hands and your face and your legs and your private parts and all those areas to receive stimulus. So if we look at that, we can see that your nervous system really has two parts to it, right? Or actually three parts. The first is receiving sensory information. So you see, hear, touch, taste, all that stuff. Those are sensory neurons. They're going to be receiving information and sending it to your brain. Your brain is sort of the integration unit. It's kind of the central processor, and it's going to kind of put meaning to it and then connect to those parts of the body that need to know about that information, right? And a lot of those neurons are then going to send information to motor neurons. Motor neurons connect to muscles. We just talked about muscles in the muscular system. Well, muscles do things voluntarily based on information from your brain, from your central nervous system. So motor neurons then respond. So this is an example of stimulus and response through sensory neurons and brain and motor neurons. Okay. We don't always have to use the brain in terms of integrating information. Sometimes we can just receive information and respond right away. You might grab something that's really hot and instantly pull away before you even feel the pain in your hands. Those are called reflex arcs. And what a reflex arc is, it's basically a sensory neuron that's connected to a motor neuron through a little intermediary here called an interneuron. So you've all been to the doctor. When you go to the doctor and he whacks you on the knee, he's hitting a tendon that's connected to a muscle up here. It causes that muscle, when you hit here, to stretch a little bit. That stimulates a sensory neuron and causes it to fire off a signal. And that signal will go right up into your backbone, cross to an interneuron, and go right to a motor neuron on the opposite side of your leg, the antagonistic or opposite muscle, and it will tell that muscle to contract. When it does, it's going to cause your leg to go out and you're going to kick. So you've had that sensation. You've probably wondered why your leg does that when you get whacked in the knee. It's a reflex arc. It's a simple set of neurons that respond without your brain in an involuntary way, and those are just called reflex arcs. So now let's look at the basic structure of a neuron. You looked at these in the cell tissue lab, and you know the basic unit of the nervous system is the neuron, and the neuron has three parts, right? It's got dendrites. Dendrites are these little fine hairs that extend off of the main cell body, and they receive chemical signals called neurotransmitters. And if they receive enough of a chemical signal, they will signal an action potential. They will send a signal down the nerve in this direction. The main part of this neuron is called a cell body. It's got the nucleus, it's got the mitochondria, the ribosomes, the other things that the neuron needs for its survival are all in this main part, the central body. Okay. Then the last part is the longest part of the neuron, and this is the axon, and it goes all the way down. This sometimes runs from your waist all the way down to your legs, down to your feet. It's called an axon. And the axon carries the signal away from the neuron towards other neurons. So this picture down here shows a neuron sending a signal and then releasing a neurotransmitter in the area around another neuron so that it can receive that signal and possibly send that to other neurons. So you hear something, it goes to another part of your brain, goes to a motor neuron, and you respond to it by connecting these neurons in what's called neural networks. Okay. So how do these signals get sent down neurons? Well, our nerves are basically wired just like a piece of electronics is wired. And sending electrical signals is using the same electricity that is used in electronics. So to create an electrical signal, you basically have to have a voltage difference. So notice we have more positively charged ions out here. Potassium, sodium, yeah, we've got some negative chlorine and stuff. But in here we have these negatively charged proteins in the neuron. We have positively charged potassium and some negatively charged chlorine. When we add up all the ions inside and outside the neuron, we can see that there's actually more negative ions inside than there are outside. So there's a positive charge on the outside of the neuron and a slight negative charge on the inside of the neuron. And we have these proteins in our membrane that through active transport pump sodium out and potassium in, and they establish this concentration gradient such that if we open up channel proteins on here, sodium will want to come in and potassium will want to diffuse out to reestablish equilibrium, right? Remember that from the cell transport unit. So let's look at how this happens. Okay, let's say we have a nerve and it gets stimulated. It's receiving a signal, okay? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to open up these channel proteins that allow sodium to move across the membrane. And they're going to allow sodium to go into the neuron. And when that happens, it's going to become more positive as sodium moves in there. Well, as that becomes more positive, it's going to signal more of these channel proteins to open up, and more sodium is going to move in down here. That's going to cause that area to become more positive. And that's going to cause channel proteins down here to open up and allow sodium to move in, right? And that's going to cause that area to become more positive. So what we're going to have is this change in charge across the membrane is going to allow a chemical signal to move in this direction. Again, just like wiring in your house or wiring in electronics equipment. We can send those signals across that membrane as the charge changes on the membrane. Okay? So let's look at how that happens. We've got a neuron and it's got a slight negative charge inside the neuron, but when it gets stimulated, sodium starts moving in, and the sodium moves into the neuron, it starts to become more and more positive. Okay? If we just get a small stimulation, that might just be all that happens. But if we get enough stimulation and enough of these sodium channels to open up, we're going to reach that threshold whereby all of a sudden we get all these sodium channels to open up, and all that sodium is going to rush in. Okay? After it rushes in, the potassium channels open up, and the potassium, which is more higher concentration inside, is going to go out of the cell. That's going to cause the membrane to become more negatively charged, the membrane potential, the difference between inside and outside, to become more negatively charged. Okay? So let's look at how that happens in a little more detail. This is how an action potential works. We've got our negatively charged neuron. It gets stimulated. When it gets stimulated, that's going to open up sodium channels, and sodium starts to move in. As it moves in, the charge on that membrane potential becomes more positive. More positive sodium ions are going into the neuron. Once we reach that threshold level, that's going to open up all the sodium channels. Now we get a massive flow of positively charged sodium into the neuron, and it's going to go up. Once we reach this peak up here, it's going to allow the potassium channels to open up, and the potassium will diffuse out of the neuron, which causes a repolarization, meaning it's becoming more negative inside relative to outside. Okay? And then at some point, all the channels, we reach an equilibrium, and we need to recharge our neuron. And the way we do that is that sodium-potassium pump. Then we close all the channels, and we start pumping sodium out and potassium in to restore that concentration gradient, so that when we get another chemical signal from a neurotransmitter, we can fire again, right? You need to be able to react quick, quick, quick. So we need to recharge our neurons so they can keep firing and sending these action potentials. Okay? Another way we can speed up the chemical signal is we actually can put a fatty coat on this axon, this long axon. And when we do that, remember, fat is nonpolar. It doesn't conduct electricity very well, right? Electrolytes, things that have charges, conduct electricity well. So what happens is we've got these Schwann cells, which grow on the outside of the axon, and they deposit this fatty layer called myelin. And if we have a myelinated axon, what that means is that electrical current doesn't go all the way through all that tissue. It bounds over, it jumps. You can imagine like a frog jumping as opposed to like a snail crawling. And that's going to be much faster. That's going to move the chemical signal much faster across that axon. Now in the next video we'll talk about what happens when that chemical signal gets to the end of the axon, to that terminal, how it releases that neurotransmitter, and how different neurotransmitters can either excite other neurons or inhibit other neurons and cause more neural activity or suppress neural activity. But that's it. This is an introduction to the nervous system and the basic unit of the nervous system, which is the neuron. Okay.